the Great Australian Craft Show 3. You're in classroom number 2. I'm Becky Muir from Beccy's Place, and we're doing a colouring class this morning. Today I'm going to be working with the Lovely Lilies set of clear stamps, and we're actually going to be using this large image at the bottom. I have already stamped it out, as you can see, on a piece of Express It blending card. A few people have asked me what that is. I have a packet just here. This is how it looks when it comes to you. This is how I purchase it. It's specifically made for alcohol markers, which is what I'm going to be using to colour in today. Set that aside, and I have my markers out all ready to go, and I also have the colours chosen for today's project. Here they are for anyone who'd like to colour along or have a go later on. They're right there, so you might want to pause the video and just grab those codes. You can use whatever markers or pencils or watercolours that you have. Today's focus is really going to be about colouring white objects, which is not, when you first talk about it, it doesn't seem to be that difficult a thing to do because the paper we use is already white, so what's so difficult about that? Really what happens is that we're not colouring white as such. What we're doing is colouring the shadows around the white. So we're colouring for shape like we always do, but when you look at your image, let's just move all this stuff off to the side now. So when we start with our image, usually we lay down a base of colour. So if I were painting or colouring these flowers pink, we'd start with a nice light pink. We already have the white paper. So consider that your white base. So the white is already in there, and what we need to add now are the darker colours, the shadows, so the complements around the white. I'm just going to grab a scrap of turn on my light, sorry about that. So I grab a scrap of paper, that's so that the alcohol markers don't bleed through onto my desk. As I mentioned, I'm using blending card, and I have stamped on the blending card with Memento ink, which is a water-based ink. Given that it's a different colouring family, as we've discussed before, than the alcohol markers that I'm using, that's how I can ensure that they're not going to bleed, so they won't interact with each other. Okay, so I'm starting with the bowls of my flowers, and I'm going to choose some neutral greys, or they're actually the cool greys, but grey is a neutral colour. So we've got white, black and grey are all the neutral colours. So I'm going to use the neutrals today. And I'm going to start with a C3, and I'm going to start colouring in the centre of the bowl of the flower. So right in here where it would be the darkest. I'm going to use the tip of my marker just to get into all those little places. Now we don't need a lot, anywhere where the petals fold over each other. So let me just move that a little bit closer. Where the petals fold over each other, so just behind this front petal, I'm going to add a little bit of the darkest grey, which is the C3 that I'm using. And what that does, if you remember back to some previous classes, the push and the pull of colour, the darkness recedes. So that will push this petal backwards just a little bit, and also into the bowl here of my flower. So that dark tone is going to push that away and give the illusion that that's a bowl, so that's depth down there. A little bit of shadow here under the petal that's crossing over this bottom bowl. And we'll add a little bit just on the edge. So I want this petal to look as though it's tucking down and away. And again, that's the darkness. So that darker colour goes in there to give the illusion that it's moving away. Moving on to the next one. Using the tip of my marker just to get it a little bit more precise. And we're adding again that dark colour to the bowl of the flower underneath the petal where it folds, down here, just on the edge here and there. So wherever it sort of dips a little bit, I'm going to add just a titch of colour. So right up on my tip. There's not a lot in there, just a little touch of colour. And I'll build on that as I go along with my markers. So I'm going to do the same thing to each of these flowers, anywhere the petals cross over. And from the center around that well, I call it a stamen. I'm sure it's got an official title, but I just call it a stamen. And anywhere where the flower dips a little bit. Same with the fourth one. There's a bit of crossover on the front of this fourth one. And in here in the bowl, flicking a little bit. Now, there's a fold under here. So we're going to add that darkness just where the two lines meet. So where the two petals meet, where it folds over, that darkness will be just on there. It's a bit of a shadow. All right, same with this last one here, right at that line. So I'll leave it lighter on the top and darker underneath. That's that sudden step, that sudden change in color or in tone that's going to tell us that there's a sudden change. It's not a smooth transition. So there's a sudden change in color, and that will give the illusion that that's folded over. Okay, some darkness from the edge pulling backwards. There's a bit of a divot there, so use that, and underneath the petals here. All right, so we're shaping as we go. C2 is next. Now we're going to use the C2 over the C3 and a little bit further on, and that will soften up that blend and make a nice smooth transition along the petals. And then we're going up on our tip again, and we're flicking those strokes. Turn your work. So flicking out from that C3, just work in very small areas, and then fill those in slowly, and that will give you a chance just to build up that color and see what's happening as you work. So on your tip, down here around the bottom of the bowl, adding these darker tones helps to shape this flower. So just here, if I want that to look like it's a bit of a bend in my petal, I'm just going to add a bit of shadow, and that will push that down. So if I keep these areas here light, it'll be up, down, up, and that's what I'm looking for. So whenever we color, we're looking to shape the object that we're coloring by using colors, by using light and dark, shadows, tones, highlights. All right. So keep going through the bowl. Everywhere that you've added the C3, we go over with the C2. That nice smooth blend with those flicking strokes. One of the other reasons we do those flicking strokes, not only for movement, but also it helps when you have the little jagged edges, it helps to blend those markers. So instead of sort of butting together like this, they intersect like that when you have the little flicked strokes. That just gives a nice smooth transition, nice smooth blend. Now, if you are a subscriber, which you would be if you're watching, you can go back to the last Great Australian Craft Fair, where I've given tutorials on the basics of colouring, and what I talk a lot about is control of your mediums, control of your markers, and how to hold them and use them so that you're getting the best out of them. So using them up on their tip or flexing the tip so that it gives you more surface area. So have a look at those if you have a chance. All right, we're down to our C1. Now this is the lightest grey that I'm going to, no it's not, I think I've got a C0 somewhere. I'll use the C0, and I've also got a plain 0. So I'm going to start coming around the very outside edges now, and that will curl that petal over even further. Following some of the lines that are in the stamp. And you can see that that is a nice soft blend, a nice soft transition between the greys. Just working over the top of the previous marker that you laid down. Leaving all those highlight areas white, so without colour. And that's what's going to give the impression that the flowers are actually white. Around the edges, flicking that colour outward. You can keep going over and over these flowers until you're happy with the blend, but just be aware that by layering more of the grey on, you will darken that grey as you go. So you don't want to add too much because it will darken it quite a lot, particularly when you're using the C3s and the C2s. As you can see, I'm not leaving a huge amount of white space. I'm actually just leaving what I would in a highlighted area. So don't feel that you have to colour yourself into a tiny little space. You don't. And so I'm going to colour that entire bowl down there now with the C0, which obviously is a very, very light grey. And this is the final layer of colour that I'll be adding. So whatever's left of that white, that's what you'll see. This technique applies to any sort of white object that you're colouring. So if you wanted to colour a snowman or a teddy bear, it's the same idea. What you're doing is colouring the shadow rather than the actual object itself. So we use that white as the base. You imagine that white is the base, the white paper, and then you colour over the top. So you're adding those depths and shadows. So the very highlighted areas, the areas that are uppermost in the flower, are what will stay white. And that helps us to describe the shape of the flower. And to smooth out those blends so there's not a sudden step. All right, so we've got our flowers all coloured. Now, pretty much what you've got there, when you look at that, is grey flowers. Okay. What happens when we add other colours is that we take it from being so far just a black and white drawing or a grayscale drawing into a proper coloured project. So we're using now some greens on the stems. This is the YG25. Now this isn't a very big area to work with, so don't worry too much about, being extra fussy with how you colour these stems. They're very narrow. Now when I'm colouring flowers like this where the stem joins a kind of bowl, as in these lilies, what I like to do is flick some of that green up into the bowl. So with the point of my marker, I'll go back and just flick some of that green up into the bowl of the lily. You don't have to do that, but that's something that I tend to like to do. Now even though they are narrow, I am still going to work with a couple of other colors just to increase the darkness. So where the bowl sits on top of the stem, there is a bit of a shadow there, and also at the bottom of the flower. If you don't add extra colors or just break up that one green a bit, it just tends to attract your eye because you just have this massive green patch that sort of doesn't make sense with the rest of the picture, and it draws your eye there. So if we just add a little bit of darker colors just to break it up, nothing special, nothing spectacular, but it does break up. I've got a YG67 now. It just does break up that lighter green and stops it looking a bit out of place. It won't draw your eye as much. Again, don't worry too much about being fussy. It's a bit hard when it's so tiny. If it were a wider stalk, you'd be able to add all your shaping and all that sort of thing, but it's a bit difficult when it's so narrow. I'm just going to blend back over the top of those colours with the YG25 just to work them in together, and then you don't get that big green stalk. All right, we'll just colour those little stamens in the middle, or whatever they're called. And this is a sort of a yellow green. It's a YG00 and a YG21 at the base. It's just a tiny bit darker. All right. So they still look a little bit grey, as you can see. Now, as you're working into the background, what we're going to do is we're just going to add a really simple shadow. By adding a darker shadow, it actually highlights the white. It brings out the white even more. So I've got a C4. I did talk about shadows and things and grounding in the basics of colouring lessons. You might remember from that. I tend to have my light source coming from the top left-hand side, which means that the shadows will be on the bottom right-hand side. So anywhere there's a flower, the bottom right-hand side, so here's the right-hand side and the bottom, I'm going to add just a fairly thin line of C4. And that will cast a bit of a shadow, and that will ground the flower. But that darker colour will also help to boost the lighter greys and the white. So the second flower, same thing. On the right hand side and anywhere underneath. Up on the tip of my marker. We just trace down those sides. Now, if you wanted to add an entire background, you could do that too. And those extra colours, again, would help to boost the white that we have left behind. Now, by adding that darker grey, you can start to see that the flowers look more white because it's comparative. So we compare it to whatever's around it. It no longer looks like a grayscaled image, even though we've only added a couple of greens and a bit of yellow. So it's amazing just what the illusion of colour can do for us. All right, so there's our grey. We're just going to knock that back a little bit with a C2, and that will make the edges of that shadow just a little bit less sharp, because our shadows in real life aren't terribly sharp around the edges. We'll just soften that a little bit. So I'm just going over the top of the C4 and allowing it, pressing a little harder, so allowing that tip of the C2 to flex a bit more, and that will help to break up the edges of the C4. You can keep going with this, so you could go down to even a 0 if you wanted to break up those edges even more. It's probably not necessary. So this is almost ready just to use on a card. As I said, you could do a nice background with some watercolors, or you could even use your alcohol markers and do a nice background if you wanted to. That shadow that we're adding helps also to lift these flowers up off the page, because they give that illusion that they're occupying space and casting a shadow. So it gives the illusion that they have mass. And that was something that we did discuss in our basics of colouring lessons, if you wanted to go back and have a look at those. All right, so you can see that that sort of lifts them up a little bit off the page. And you can finish colouring the background if you want to, or you can just leave it like that and have a go. So the question that a lot of people ask then is, do I always have to use greys when I'm doing this kind of thing? So if I want to colour a white image, do I always need to go with my greys? The answer to that is no, absolutely not. It's really a matter of personal preference. I tend to use the greys. I like to stick with greys when I colour anything white. I have done a couple of other pictures for you, coloured a couple of other pictures for you, just to show you. So this one's done with purples and this one's done with blues, and I used the same technique. Let me move that scrap out of the way. I used the same technique but just different colours. So you would probably do this if I were going to create a card perhaps that had lots of purple background paper and embellishments, then I might choose the violets in my pen range instead of the greys. It really just depends, and as I said before, it's a matter of personal preference. If the card that you're making is for someone who particularly likes blue or purple, then you might want to go into those shades. It's really about leaving that white space, so colouring those shadows and leaving that white space instead. Okay, so that's about it from me. As you can see, it wasn't a difficult tutorial. If you have any questions, please feel free to either message me on Facebook or send me an email, becky@beckysplace.com. I'm always happy to answer those. I do have a card making class at 1 o'clock this afternoon. If you'd like to stop by, we're doing paper piecing. And then tomorrow in our colouring class at 10, we're actually going to be colouring with some white pencil, and we're going to use the Spring Tulip set. I don't even know if you can see that because it's so dark. This is a technique that I call negative colouring. I call it that because usually we start with a white background and add in the darkness. Tomorrow we're going to start with the dark background and we're going to add in our highlights. So this will be done specifically with white pencils. So if you want to join in, all you need to do is stamp or print an image onto a piece of dark cardstock. I've used a navy blue, but you can use dark red, a dark green, dark purple, whatever sort of dark color you want. Probably not a black because you will find it difficult to see the stamped image. You could go with a dark grey, and then you'll just need a white pencil, a nice soft white pencil. I'm using a Prismacolor pencil, but whatever you've got at home will be fine. So until then, enjoy the rest of your day today. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to catch up with you soon. Bye.